In 1687, Isaac Newton published the Principia Mathematica, the book that gave the world the law of universal gravitation, and with it, the mathematical foundation of modern physics. What almost nobody knows is that Newton drafted an entire additional section for that book, intended to sit right alongside his proof of the law of gravity, and then pulled it before publication. In it, he wasn't proving anything new. He was arguing something much stranger that the ancients had already known. Not vaguely, specifically, Newton claimed that Pythagoras had discovered the same inverse square law relationship governing gravity centuries before Newton, using the vibration of strings on a musical instrument, and that a legendary early king of Rome had learned heliocentrism, the idea that the earth orbits around the sun, from the Egyptians. These passages sat almost entirely unread for nearly 3 centuries. Historians now call them Newton's Classical Scholia, and what they reveal is a side of the most celebrated scientist in history that most popular science education leaves out entirely. Part 1. What Newton actually believed. Last episode, we looked at Newton's private alchemical work, his hand translations of the Emerald Tablet, and the years he spent believing ancient texts had held encoded knowledge about the hidden workings of nature. That belief had a name in the intellectual culture Newton inherited, Principia Sapientia, Latin for ancient wisdom, sometimes also called Principia Theologia. The same concept we encountered back in episode 1, driving the Renaissance excitement around Hermes Trismegistus. The core idea, again, that a single, true, unified knowledge of nature and God had been given to humanity in the deep past. For Newton specifically, this traced back through his own theological framework to Adam, and then survived only in fragments, scattered and half forgotten, passed down through a change of ancient sages, Egyptian priests, Pythagoras, Moses, and others, recovering true knowledge of nature. And this view wasn't just about discovering new things, it was about excavating what had already once been known and subsequently lost or obscured. Historians studying Newton's private papers, most of which remained unpublished and largely unexamined until the 20th century, have found this belief wasn't a minor eccentricity confined to his alchemical notebooks. It shows up directly in his approach to his most serious scientific work, the Principia itself. Sometimes, in the early 1690s, in preparation what he hoped will be a second edition, Newton drafted a set of scholia, explanatory notes, intended to accompany propositions 4th through the 9th of Book 3, the section of the Principia containing his proof of universal gravitation. Modern scholars call this material the Classical Scholia, and it wasn't published in Newton's lifetime, or for nearly 300 years afterward. It first came to serious scholarly attention through a landmark 1966 paper by historians James McGuire and P.J. Rattanzi, titled memorably Newton and the Pipes of Pan. What McGuire and Rattanzi found, working through Newton's own manuscripts, was that in these draft scholia, Newton set out to establish what the ancients had already possessed genuine knowledge of 4 core principles of physics underlying in his own theory of gravity. That matter is atomic in structure, moving through empty space, that gravitational force acts universally on all matter, that this force diminishes according to the inverse square law of the distance between bodies, and that the true structure of the cosmos is heliocentric, with the planets orbiting around the sun. Part 2. The actual arguments. Let's go through what Newton actually claimed because the specifics are more remarkable than the general summary can convey. On the inverse square law itself, arguably the most single important mathematical relationship in the Principia, Newton turned to Pythagoras. Ancient tradition held that Pythagoras had discovered that harmonious musical intervals correspond to simple mathematical ratios between the lengths of a vibrating string, the foundation of what became known as the harmony of the spheres. The idea that the same numerical ratios governing pleasant music harmony also governed the motions and spacing of the heavenly bodies. Newton's move here is genuinely striking. He argued that Pythagoras' musical ratios were merely a poetic metaphor for cosmic order, as later readers assumed, but were, in Newton's reading, an intentionally encoded description of the actual inverse square law relationship governing gravitational force. The same relationship Newton himself had derived mathematically in the Principia. In Newton's account, the image of the music of the sphere doesn't describe literal music at all. It's a symbolic encoding of real physics, deliberately obscured in mythological language by philosophers protecting sacred knowledge from being misused by the uninitiated. On heliocentrism specifically, Newton's argument takes an unexpected route through Roman legend rather than Greek philosophy. He credited the semi-legendary second king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, with having introduced heliocentric cosmology to the Roman world, and suggested Numa likely acquired this knowledge originally from the Egyptians. This is a genuinely curious historical claim on Newton's part, since Numa Pompilius is a figure of very uncertain historicity even by ancient standards, treated by many ancient authors themselves as legendary. Newton was working here from classical sources like Plutarch, mining ancient literature for any fragments that could be read as evidence of prior hidden astronomical knowledge. On universal gravitation and atomism more broadly, Newton drew on a wider range of classical sources. Passages from Plutarch's Essay on the Phase of the Moon, which discusses lunar orbital motion in terms of a balance between an inward pull and an outward motion, and material from Seneca's describing planetary motion around the Sun in comparable terms. Newton incorporated these passages into his drive to Scholia, in some cases lifting extended material nearly directly as evidence that ancient natural philosophers had already grasped the basic mechanics later formalized in his own law of gravitation. Now, an important scholarly correction here, because this is exactly the kind of point that separates careful history from an appealing but inaccurate narrative. It will be easy and dramatic to say that Newton's Classical Scholia directly cites the Corpus Hermeticum, drawing a clear line from a Hermetic text we have covered in past episodes straight into the Principia. That's not quite what the manuscript evidence shows. The historian Paolo Cassini, in a detailed 1984 critical study of the Classical Scholia, points out that Newton's draft material doesn't actually mention Hermes Trismegistus or the Corpus Hermeticum by name at all. The name sources are Pythagoras, Numa Pompilius, the Egyptians in the general sense, Plutarch, Seneca, and various Neoplatonist philosophers, a broader classical Prisca Sapienta argument, not specifically a Hermetic one. What we can say accurately, and it's still a remarkable claim, the same man who spent years hand-copying and studying genuinely Hermetic material, as we covered in the last episode, also built a private, unpublished argument attempting to prove that his own landmark scientific discoveries had been anticipated by ancient philosophers, using the same underlying conviction that drove his engagement with Hermetic text, that true knowledge of nature is ancient, was once more complete, and had been lost. The Classical Scholia and the Alchemical Notebooks are two separate bodies of evidence, but they are expressions of the same worldview. Part 3. Why did Newton pull it? If Newton believed all this, why isn't any of it in the published Principia? Historians offer a few convergent explanations, and it's worth going through them rather than picking one. because the honest answer is that multiple factors likely played a role simultaneously. First, and more straightforward, even by the most permissive intellectual standards of the late 17th century, this material was scientifically and rhetorically risky. The Principia's core achievement, mathematically rigorous, empirically testable claims about force and motion, didn't actually need an ancient validation to be persuasive to Newton's scientific contemporaries. Attaching a speculative classical philology to what was otherwise a landmark of mathematical physics risked undermining the credibility of the entire work in the eyes of the emergent scientific community Newton was trying to persuade. Second, some of Newton's own contemporaries who reviewed his draft material included the astronomer David Gregory, whose notes are one of the main surviving sources historians have used to reconstruct the Classical Scholia in the first place, appeared to have been part of a classical argument strained or unpersuasive even by the standards of ancient wisdom scholarship at that time. Not every reader shared Newton's confidence in reading Pythagorean music theory as an encoded physics textbook. Third, and this connects to a broader pattern across Newton's life we're building towards across this whole series. Newton was, by nature, intensely private about several major areas of his intellectual work. His alchemical research is unorthodox theological views. He privately rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, a position that would have been genuinely dangerous to make public in his time. And it seems this classical argument for ancient scientific knowledge were all kept substantially out of the public view during his lifetime. Newton seems to have drawn a real distinction between what he was confident enough in to stake his public scientific reputation on and what remained for him a private and ongoing area of investigation. The scholarly debate hasn't fully settled on how central this ancient wisdom belief was to Newton, actual scientific progress, versus how much it was a separate, parallel intellectual interest that ran alongside his physics without directly generating it. Maguire and Rattanzi, original 1966 paper, leaned towards seeing it as a genuine central to how Newton understood his own achievement, essentially restoration rather than pure discovery. Cassini's later more critical 1984 study pushes back somewhat, arguing for a more measured reading of exactly how much weight this material should carry in our overall picture of Newton. That's a live and ongoing scholarly conversation, not a fully closed question, and is worth us being honest about the uncertainty rather than presenting one side as a settled fact. Part 4. What this actually tells us. Step back from the specific historical debate for a moment, and there's a bigger point worth sitting with. The popular image of Newton, the clean, rational father of modern physics, the man who saw an apple fall and derived the mathematics of the universe, is real. But it's a curated fraction of a much stranger, much complicated person. The private Newton spent comparable and by some manuscript volume accounts even greater amounts of time on alchemy, unorthodox theology, and biblical chronology that he spent on the physics he's remembered for. And running underneath much of that private work was this same consistent conviction that we are not the first people to have gotten close to the truth about how the universe works. That the ancients, however imperfectly, however much has been lost or garbled in transmission, got there first, encoded it in myth, mathematics, and scripture, and left it for someone patient and clever enough to decode. Newton, as it turns out, believed he was that person, not inventing physics from nothing, but recovering it, explaining it. Whether or not you find this specific classical argument persuasive, and there's genuine, serious scholarly disagreement about how seriously to weigh them, these reframe something important about the relationship between ancient philosophy and modern science that this channel keeps trying to return to. It's not simple that ancient thinkers were wrong about modern science, eventually correcting them. A clean story of progress from myth to fact, that at least one of history's more consequential scientific minds, the relationship felt much more like a continuity, an unfinished conversation with the ancient world that he is still actively trying to complete, right at the same desk where he is deriving the mathematics that will define physics for the next 2 centuries. In closing, so did the ancients already know the laws of gravity? Not in the way Newton hoped to prove. Most of his specific classical readings don't hold up as literary anticipations of his mathematics under modern scrutiny, and serious historians remain divided on how much weight to give to the whole argument. But the fact that Newton believed it, argued it in careful scholarly detail, and only pulled it from publication for reasons that were more about caution and privacy than a change of conviction, that's real, documented, and largely absent from how Newton gets taught. We have now spent 4 episodes with him, the secret alchemist, the hidden translator over the emerald tablet, and now the physicist quietly trying to prove his own greatest discovery had already made millennia before he was born. In the next episode, we're going to step back from Newton specifically and go into the Corpus Hermeticum's account of the mind and the structure of the cosmos, the material that will let us finally start building the bridge this whole channel exists to build. There was modern physics and the harder, stranger questions waiting farther down this road. If you want history that doesn't flatten and is most interesting to people into simple stories, subscribe. We're just getting started. Thanks a lot.